This is Dennis Raimondi. I'm here with the Coffee League, founded at thecoffeeleague.com. Our guest today, Scott Carey. He is the owner and operates Sump Coffee in St. Louis and now also in Nashville, Tennessee. And I just want to say, before we start the interview, I travel around with my wife. We go to dozens of cafes all over the country every month. And every once in a while, I come into a place and it really strikes me as something special. And that's what I felt the other day when I went to Sump Coffee in St. Louis. I hadn't been there before. The decor, the design, how it's laid out, the vibe, the culture there, and also fabulous coffee. He roasts and he has a cafe there. And if you're in St. Louis, I highly, highly recommend it. Scott, thank you so very much for taking the time to speak with me today.
No problem at all. Thanks for having us on.
So I know a little bit about you. I read you were a straight A student at University of California, Berkeley, got a master's in chemistry, and then you got your law degree. Were practicing law in New York. How did you find your way to coffee?
Well, it's a little bit of a long story, I guess, but just I'll try and be as brief as possible. I got hooked into coffee, just drinking it, consuming it. I mean, I've consumed it all my life, but consumed it in a sort of, I guess, specialty cafe or specialty coffee way, probably around '04, '05. I was living in Alphabet City in New York City on 7th and C, 9th Street Espresso, the original 9th Street opened maybe the year before on 9th and C. And so that just living so close by, that just became part of my ritual. So the thing that sort of turned my head initially, again, I've been, I was probably like in the 26th grade before I graduated college, if you consider like graduate school and law school. So I was very familiar with coffee as a stimulant, as, kind of a pick-me-up after dinner thing. But the thing that kind of turned my head and made me kind of notice that coffee could be something else besides this functional dosing was this experience I had at 9th Street Espresso. And this is before 9th Street Espresso is what it is today. So it was very DIY. I think Ken had just sold the bar that was on the corner and started getting into the specialty game and did this shop. And it was before their deconstructed milk menu and everything. And there was an individual named Bob in there, and he was from Portland. I feel like a lot of the early coffee scene in New York were people that were on the West Coast, Seattle, Portland, etc., that wanted to move to New York because New York just had a certain energy at that time. And he made a latte. I just got a latte to go. And he did a little Rosetto on it. And that was the first time I saw that. But he was kind of a grumpy guy, looked kind of grumpy. I'm sure he was a very nice guy. I never knew him personally. But he just set that down with a lid next to it, gave me the total. He was in the back reading a book. So there was no real demand curve even really for what was happening at that time. I looked down to put the lid on, and I saw that, and I looked up, and I was like, did you do this? Kind of was what I was thinking in my head. And he didn't smile. He didn't acknowledge it. Didn't be like, it was just like, I want to get back to reading my book kind of thing. So it was a very nice beverage. It was tasty. I still think they do some of the strongest milk drinks in New York City. So that became part of my routine. And why it became part of my routine as opposed to getting coffee at like a bodega, which is pretty much, I feel, up to that point where you could get coffee in New York City, was a bodega or maybe a Starbucks, was that in the early morning hours, there isn't like a specialty kind of beverage like at the end of the day. Like you can have a nice glass of wine, a pour of scotch, or just something that you can say, all right, you know what, I deserve this. I went through my whole day. It went sideways. It didn't go according to plan, and I deserve this special moment. And the beginning part of the day, which I'll call the anchor, the thing that, let's say you have your schedule, you have your day plan or whatever you call it now, and the things you're going to do before that thing gets totally wiped out or blown out, you can have this elevated, intentional beverage, which is coffee, and it's culturally appropriate. So that's how I sort of got into it. I came to St. Louis for personal reasons. My brother was sick. At the time, there was not a coffee experience like that. There was not this sort of intentional anchor, if you will. And, obviously I must have been dissatisfied with what I was doing. So, I got this idea, and there are a number of other factors involved, and have enough time to go into it. But that's how I started it. So I was like, well, St. Louis is missing this experience. I know that most ideas from the coast propagate into the middle at some point. And, St. Louis is an inexpensive market relatively, and I was naive enough, and I want to underscore that, I was naive enough to believe that I could do it. And that's my partner and her name's Mars. That's how we started it. So
it's interesting. I wanted to say, Scott, one of my first experiences of specialty coffee, the first one in New York, was at 9th Street Espresso. And actually, on our podcast here, I've interviewed Kenneth Nye, the owner, and it's a lot user friendly now. But when you first went in there, you got the coffee, you better like it, and that was it. But they did great coffee. And I also want to ask you, when you I read this, yet your brother, you went off and became a lawyer. Your brother was more of a craftsman. He built things. Was that part of your desire to get into coffee, to open a cafe, to create something that reflected what you wanted to reflect? And like I said, for those of you who haven't been to Sump Coffee in St. Louis, go there. The design, everything about it, I feel is somewhat unique, and obviously a lot of attention and detail went into it. So did you go from a period where you were a lawyer doing a lot of intellectual work, where now you wanted to be doing something more artistic, more as a craftsman?
Yeah, that's a really complicated question. So the only thing I ever built up to that point in my life, I say, is a paragraph. That's really the only thing I've ever built. And I think and this gets into politics, like blue, red state, all kinds of stuff. I think there's a disdain sometimes among intellectuals for people that are kind of, making things, not craft things, not elevated, not artsy things that end up on Etsy, but for the people that are framing houses and pouring highways. There's this tension, and I think maybe at some point in my life I was maybe even guilty of it. It's like, well, I'm smart, I'm clever, I test well, so I don't really have to work outside, kind of things like that. And so part of this kind of connecting with my brother at the end of his life was realizing really how amazing and special that really is, and kind of wanting to do something in part with him. I think, this is way more than you have time for, but I believe there's this younging voice in us. And it happened to Young as he fell out with his mentor. But there's this voice in terms of like when we're small children, if we like to build, or if we like to color, or draw, or talk, or perform, at some point we repress some of that stuff because we know we have to earn a living, we have to get married, have kids, become respectable. So by pushing some of those things down, at some point in your life that bubbles up again. And oftentimes it's called, midlife crisis. It can be called an existential crisis. So I think I always wanted to be creative. I think in my early part of my life, I tried to be creative. But I think through fear of being poor or fear of failing, I chose paths that were a little bit more clear in terms of how they work in society and how they get compensated. And so I think seeing my brother pass away at a young age, the idea is, in trying to help him die in a way. Like, I have no power. I'm not a doctor. I see him suffering. I see his family suffering. The only thing I can do is read books. That's all I've ever really been good at. And I read a lot of books, and the ones that resonated the most with me was, write your eulogy now, and what you say in that, that means that's how you want people to see you on your way out. Mm-hmm. And if you really can't have those things be represented and seen in yourself, then you're living your life the wrong way currently. And so it was a combination of, yes, wanting to build something and going back to probably that child in myself, connecting to my brother, and wanting to do something with him. Again, the opportunity in this market, the price point in this market in St. Louis. So it's a combination of factors. But yeah, the nut of that is, I wanted to make something. And so the intentionality when we built the space, we did all the demo, we did all the work ourselves, and everything that we had in the day we opened the cafe, we had built ourselves. Now, over time, we've had really great customers who have been craftspeople who kind of want to contribute or enjoyed the experience and want to contribute to the experience or contribute to the journey. And some of those pieces that we originally built, which were terrible, I am not a craftsperson, I'm not natively gifted, have been replaced by pieces that I think are outstanding, and people really respond to it. So it is a little bit more eclectic. But yeah, that's how it came together. Right. Especially when you compare it to Nashville. So Nashville, I don't live above the shop in Nashville, where I live above the shop in St. Louis. So when we opened Nashville, it had to be ready all at once, and so that means we had to bring in a lot of outside vendors. So that ability from us to build something or craft it myself, it just didn't work out in terms of the time frame, especially running the shop in St. Louis.
Right, Scott. So you get into this business, you come down, you create something, and it's new or relatively new to you. How do you learn to make great coffee? How do you learn to roast? I read that there was a guy at Caldi's in St. Louis, Mike, that was somewhat of a mentor for you or helped you out in that way. How did you come up the learning curve and create the great coffee that you're producing now?
Well, I would like to correct that. There was no one at Caldi's that was a mentor to me.
Okay.
I would say, so when we opened, we were a multi-roaster, and so the model was very much like, let's just bring in great coffees. And so when we brought in great coffee, so like some places, like low-hanging fruits, like websites, there weren't that many, but people would, kind of like we're doing with podcasts, would remark or comment on coffees, or you meet people, and then we try and bring those coffees in. And we learned from that experience. But we learned based on our palate and what we favored. So, as I said, I started and I discovered kind of this elevated daily experience of drinking coffee in New York at Ninth Street, but that's certainly not our roast style, and that's not what we're trying to present in terms of coffee or brand identity. So I think, once you, I tell people often, it seems like people see specialty coffee and they say, hey, this is a way for us to be creative, and kind of technically, the equipment's not that expensive, so it's kind of low-hanging fruit. It's not like starting a biotech company. And so a lot of people, want to get in the game, and a number of people sort of ask me and say, hey, I want to start a cafe, I want to start roasting. Can you give me any advice? And I usually only have two bits of advice. One is have enough operating capital for a whole year. So don't expect to make any money and never expect to be wealthy. I would make more money being an attorney if I was still an attorney, unless it scales. But know what you want. So you might not know how to get there, but if you keep detailed notes and you know what you want, you'll get there eventually. If you don't really know what you want, everyone who's a customer or a friend is going to have ideas for you to execute on your business. They're going to say, oh, you should roast darker, you should roast lighter, you should have ice cream, and if you don't really have a strong voice driving you forward, you're going to listen to a lot of those things, and you're going to get off mission. So I would say, being a chemistry student for a very long time, having a degree in chemistry, that taught me how to manage details and keep track of details. Same with being a lawyer, really. That causes you to articulate the details. And so I didn't know exactly when we started roasting how to roast or where we're going to go or anything like that, but I knew what I wanted because I enjoyed certain coffees that first year we were a multi-roaster. And I would say probably for me, and I would say even our early client base, the roaster for me that stood out and the one that was the most helpful, so if you want to give credit, was this roaster still in business. They're called it's called Kuma Coffee. They're in Seattle. Mm-hmm. His name is Mark. So he was roasting on a 12-kilogram Probat, and I was buying coffee from him as well as some other roasters. And during that window of time, those were some of the most door-opening, kind of mind-expanding coffees I've ever had in my life. And it was a result of those experiences that when I then took to roasting myself, obviously, when you do anything artistic, the first thing you do is you steal from the people you admire. So you try and emulate them. And then when you get control of the tools, that's part of the craft, then you find your own expression. And so I would say that individual and having conversations with him at that time in my life were probably the most helpful in helping me articulate what our style would be, and understanding at least how he articulated his style, and giving me confidence in saying, yeah, this is all right to think this way about coffee.
Do you consider yourself more of a roaster or a barista?
Well, I consider myself a jack of all trades.
Well, I guess what I should ask is, which one do you enjoy the most?
Well, I think everything we do has to stand on the coffee. And
Right.
so the thing that I am the most obsessed about is sourcing the coffee and setting the profile for each coffee, because everything else falls and follows from that. So bringing in good quality green, having a good representation of that green and the style and what we want to do and say with coffee, that's the core. So that's the thing that I probably obsess the most about in terms of the sort of craft or artistic side. The numbers and the economics and managing people and keeping everyone happy is also something you obsess about too, but you have to. But in terms of the craft or the creative side, that's what I do. And I think to me, that embodies to me the most aspect of the craft or the artistry of specialty coffee.
And how do you go about sourcing for somebody that doesn't know much about that? I mean, that's a huge part of what you do. How do you learn that, and what angle do you take?
Well, so we've always been current crop, so fresh crop, never get anything old, and just single origin, single varietal, single estate where we can get it if we can get it. So that's always the approach, kind of like bringing in coffee, almost like experiencing coffee like wine. I know that's a little bit overused, but also relying on the fact that, coffee is a seed. It comes from a fruit. So when we book coffees and bring coffees in from certain regions, we're bringing them in because there's some relationship to the concept of what a fruit is, in my opinion. So, for instance, we've never brought in a Brazil or roasted a Brazil. Now, I know I still bring in green sample roast them, try them out, but there's a lot of low elevation coffees in Brazil. That nut profile is not a profile that I look for. I look for, again, not citrus, but fruit, sweetness, complexity. Those are the things I look for in the coffee, and that's what we try and bring in. So that means we rely on certain regions, but that's the sourcing model. And the other part of your question was, how do you get into that? How do you do that? Well, it's pretty hard. It seems like a mystery initially, but you end up developing relationships with people you trust that they help you get into it. So I would say Mark from Kuma Coffee was somebody that, even though I guess technically we're competitors, he kind of helped talk about that to me. And then I would say another person that was tremendously helpful and probably somebody worth having on your podcast that everyone in the specialty coffee industry knows is somebody named Joe Morocco. He's from St. Louis. He works at Cafe Imports, but he does education stuff. Cafe Imports, they sponsor a lot of competitions, so he's kind of like a coffee celebrity. But he's over the years he's been extremely generous with his time and his knowledge. And so I would say those two people helped me walk through the door. And then as you spend more and more time in the industry and you go to SCA shows and things like that, you meet more people and you network, and different people have different motivations, but you find that good people will have things they're willing to share with you, and you grow within that environment. You discover there's more written and published material now than there was 6 years ago when I started. You could get like the guy from Square Mile, his book Coffee Atlas, that has a tremendous amount of information in it. I mean, anyone who's winning or who has a successful store, I think Tim Wendelbo is working on his second book now or something like that. there's lots of good information out there. There's
Yeah.
people who are consultants like Scott Rao, who's selling his services and self-publishing books, and so there's just a wealth of information. So even if you're a misanthrope and you're not friendly with anybody, there's enough literature and there's enough consultants out there that you could, if you know what you want to do again, you can put a plan in action.
Right. You mentioned Tim Windelbo. He's also an interview we have up here on the podcast. Went to his cafe in Oslo, Norway. Fabulous, very, very interesting guy. Scott, I wanted to ask you how important milk and water is in producing really good coffee. I think I also read that you really researched milk a lot when you got in the business.
Yeah. So, and again, I think the milk side of things, I think, go back to the early days of 9th Street Espresso. I think when 9th Street started, they had some of the most exceptional milk I ever experienced. And I think as they scaled and as cost became an issue and things like that, they changed their core milk program. And I think they offered that milk still for the upside in terms of the sale. But yeah, that to me, for a milk drink, especially if you try, like early on, we tried to be, I guess, pretty typical of specialty coffee or hipster coffee, is we're like, no sugar, no cream, no nothing, right? This is it, no decaf. So we tried to be pretty hardline, and not just to be arrogant, not to say, hey, we're right, but because of that put a lot more emphasis on finding the right milk. Because with the right milk, you have sugars, you have sweetness, you get to balance all that out. So all the adjuncts you want to put in with like a low quality milk, when you feel like you need to sweeten it up because the coffee's like too expressive or something like that, that goes out the window. So if you're careful in curating your milk program, you can, in a way, if you build trust to the client base, you can demonstrate that you don't need to put those things in there, and that the thing that we're building and putting together and that the professionals are investing their life in is worth having as prepared. So the best milk that I've had, and now that we're in 2 markets in 2 states, I still think the Ozark Mountain Creamery, which is in the southern part of Missouri. That pasteurized. It's 2 brothers. They control the cows, so they don't bring in the milk from other cows from anywhere else. And their processing facility is like on the property line of their 2 farms. I think they were probably DIY or somewhat cash-strapped, and so they picked old-style equipment, from what I understand. Mm-hmm. And so the vat pasteurization is like something like 150 degrees, 145 degrees for a half hour. So in my opinion, that preserves more milk fats and milk sugars as opposed to flash pasteurization. And then their homogenizing machine, the way I understand that works, the sort of pistons that move back and forth to homogenize the milk, those holes in those pistons are a larger size than more contemporary, efficient, newer equipment. And to me, that creates a bigger, fatter mouthfeel for the milk. So there's more sweetness and there's more weight. Whereas in contrast, when in Nashville, we've already been through 3 milk providers, and I still don't know that we've really found the right one, but we had a flash pasteurized provider that flashed and everything, chilled it quickly, and it was cream top. That was very difficult. And then we had one that pasteurized from the state of Kentucky, but I think their homogenizer was more modern. They didn't control the cows, so the quality of the milk would change because they're different farms. And so you didn't get the same consistency and quality, and you didn't get the same kind of mouthfeel of the fat. And now we have somebody that is a little easier to work with. I'm not sure it's a winner yet either. So it's super important, especially if you're trying to be super coffee forward. If you are just doing milk and espresso drinks and you have a full condiment bar, maybe not as critical. But if you're trying to create a more curated experience and build that trust with your client base or your customer base, I think milk is critical. To the second question, water is super important also because that allows you to sort of express what you want to express in your coffee. Just like when people do different roast levels on their coffee, they kind of express different elements in the bean. The water hardness or the water conditioning allows you to do some of those things. So, the SCA, I think, recommends a hardness of something like 150 ppms. In Nashville, we have a reverse osmotic remineralizer system that we keep the ppms at 50 ppms there. So the water is very soft, but I think the cups are very lush and sweet. In St. Louis, we have really good water natively here. It's not as hard as the water in Nashville. So we don't have an RO system, but we do have a conditioning system that softens and then buffers. So the ppm is probably a little higher here, but the water is just sort of natively in St. Louis pretty tasty.
Right. One other question, Scott, and that is, in my visiting many cafes every month, one issue that comes up pretty regularly, especially in areas where specialty coffee is relatively new to the scene, where the culture of specialty coffee is developing, and that is the inconsistency of baristas. Some cafes I go to, and I'll only go to that cafe if I know a certain barista is there, because they'll have one person that's really well trained, really knows what they're doing, another person that seems to have had little training. Sometimes they hire people from other places, and there's a real inconsistency from barista to barista. Is that something you've had to deal with?
Of course. I mean, you always have to deal with that. So the thing with specialty coffee is that if you really want to do it right, your labor costs are really high. So just remarking on what you said, the only way you can retain talent and get people to commit is to pay them a good wage. And if you treat them as a sort of a point of input, you're going to have a lot of turnover, and as a result, you're going to have a lot of inconsistency. So that's why in our shop, we have very little. We've been lucky. We've had very little turnover. We've been in business for over 6 years. Our longest standing employee was here for 5.5 years. He just left for family reasons to start a family. We had an employee who was here for 4 years, his entire college career. So having that consistency and developing talent and having them have some degree of buy-in to what you're doing and let them vest and feel part of that, success of the shop is very important. But that means it's very expensive in terms of a labor model. So it's not like I'm going to sell a lot of coffee, I'm going to do it cheaply. But to balance that and acknowledge that very fact, even with well-trained people, example, manual brewing, people have different body mechanics, different heights, you know what I mean? So
right.
Some people hold the kettle higher, like if somebody's like, I'm 6'2", so I'm going to hold the kettle much higher than somebody who's like 5'3". And that difference in the pour and fall rate for manual brewing is going to change the water temperature. It's going to change the dynamics in the slurry bed, all that stuff. So to that end, our shop has adopted some automation, if you will. We're not doing, let's say, full batch brewing yet, but we are using this device called a Pour Steady, which is essentially a robot arm that has a gooseneck kettle on it that does single serve a brew. So it has a recipe for a pour geometry and a pour rate, and that's what we use. So we get a very consistent cup. And so some baristas initially, when we brought it in, would bristle at that and say, you're kind of taking my professionalism away. And my response is, I'm actually not. I'm adding to your professionalism. So before, when you would brew for somebody, you're looking at a timer, you're looking at mass, you're trying to control the flow rate, doing the geometry, and you can't connect to a guest. You can't connect to somebody who has a ton of questions about specialty coffee because, when we sell a bag of coffee, we don't sell a finished product. So people need to take that home, and they have to be empowered to brew that correctly. So with this Pour Steady device and product, it has its failings too. It's a brew device just like anything else. But what it does is it allows our staff actually to be more like a professional kind of sommelier would be the analogy.
Right.
We can talk more in depth about the coffee, where we get it, our brew recipes, and they're not going to space out. They're not going to forget a pour. They're not going to create an inconsistent cup. And I know no matter what shop you go to, whether it's St. Louis or Nashville, because that device is on the bar and everything is pre-dosed and pre-weighed and we've QC'd the roast at the roastery, that everyone who comes in is going to get the cup that we set up for them. Now, espresso is a different story, and that's totally challenging in itself in its own right, and that could take up a call or an interview all by itself.
Uh-huh.
But so those are some of the balancing. That's that push-pull. So you do see that. You do see like exactly what you see. Even at 9th Street, when I would go there would be one barista that had really, really I'll call thick hands. And the milk temp was much hotter than anybody else that worked there. But this person was very skilled. This person was very qualified and came from a good pedigree, and they were pulling shots. It's just that the way they tempt the pitcher based on their body mechanics and how they experience heat was different, and it created a different beverage. So, you nail it on the head. And so the only way to fight against that is you try and cultivate staff that will stay with you a long time. You have to pay them or reward them appropriately, and train and retrain and make people feel comfortable in the things they don't know and confident in the things they do know.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Hey, Scott, I have to ask you, what are your coffee drinking habits? How do you brew your coffee, and how often do you drink it every day?
Well, it really depends. I mean, I can drink so much caffeine in a single day, like if we're cupping for QC, that I don't even keep track. But usually I am a brewed coffee person, so I will say that in general I focus a lot on the brewed coffee because that's to me the closest expression of that coffee. So it's usually, I like a nice clean cup, so that means I like something like a V60, which is a Hario product.
Right.
Recently, we've been getting into some of the St. Anthony stuff. So they have a C70. There's the Phoenix. So in those, it's that realm that I like to look at coffee and experience it. So that more cleaner, clarified expression of the coffee. So I can drink a lot of coffee, or I can drink very little coffee. And for the most part, I'm okay. Caffeine doesn't really affect me the way I feel like it affects other people. Like I don't typically have to spit when I cup, even when I cup a lot of coffees. I will get nauseous. I won't get like a headache or anything. I will get palate fatigue, but I've cupped, like 20 coffees with somebody once, and they're, at midway through, they're like, I can't do this anymore. So, I mean, I'm a pretty big guy, so I guess there's a lot of body mass, but, I would say for me, I really like a nice, clean, sort of single cup, if you will, single brewed cup of coffee. That's the sweet spot for me.
Great. And finally, since you started in St. Louis, has your customer base and the customer base in general for coffee become more and more sophisticated and more familiar with specialty coffee?
Oh yeah, I would say the market here is tremendously competitive. I mean, it was always competitive, but yeah, the market everywhere. Mm-hmm. Just comparing 6 years, you can show up in almost any city and get some degree of like a quality specialty coffee experience. So yeah, competition in the marketplace here in St. Louis, everywhere. Nashville, smaller cities that people wouldn't think about before, let's say, 6 years ago as having any specialty coffee. They have shops, they have, a beachfront or a beachhead or the start of something. So, yeah, this market is tremendously competitive.
Great. Scott, it's been great speaking with you. And for those listening in to this podcast, Scott Carey, owner of Sump Coffee in St. Louis and now also in Nashville, highly recommend it. Stop in. It's a great visual experience and great coffee. So, Scott, thank you so very much for your time.
Oh, yeah. No, I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Right.